I see it in three stages. One is what I would call the archetypical great debate, and that was the tension between those leaders, primarily who were doing slavery, who wanted to repatriate back to Africa, and then another group of people who wanted to assimilate into American society. So out of those who wanted to repatriate, you got the establishment of the country of Liberia on about the time of the Civil War. And for those that wanted to repatriate after the American Revolution, you got the establishment of Sierra Leone. So there were actually two colonies established from ex-slaves from America, Sierra Leone during the period of the American Revolution, and then you had Liberia during the period of the Civil War. And you had other people who felt that they didn't leave anything in Africa, didn't want to go back. So they would say, as soon as we're free, we're going to assimilate into America. Well, when slavery ended in 1865, there was the illusion of assimilation, but the reality of Jim Crow. So out of that dialectic came another great debate, and that great debate was between what we might call separation and integration. And you had people who wanted to take those positions. And this one I would call the prototypical great debate. And that was the great debate between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois.
Most of us know that debate.
That's the most familiar one. Du Bois was, and they both dealt with educational institutions. Du Bois pushed a liberal arts agenda for the private schools, because he was a graduate of Fisk University. And Booker T. Washington pushed more or less an agenda of self-determination, lifting yourself up by your own bootstraps. And he developed it based on the A&I model, agricultural and industrial. So out of that came, out of his vision came a lot of your land grant schools like Tennessee State University, Arkansas A&M, Florida A&M, and so forth. So Booker T. Washington's philosophy was more of a land grant philosophy, where development was based on the land and agriculture, and Du Bois's philosophy was more liberal arts. And so he wanted people to become scholars, intellectuals, and study the classics. And so they clash, you know, and Du Bois is probably best known for his role in being one of the founders of the NAACP, and then later on being a person who created the early Pan-African movements. He did 5 Pan-African movements, so he went from the assimilation with NAACP, then he became a Pan-Africanist, a socialist, and finally he left the country and repatriated himself to Ghana, where he was a guest there of Kwame Nkrumah, the first African head of state there in Ghana. Now, of course, with Booker T. Washington's legacy, which was one of economic self-sufficiency and economic self-determination, his argument was picked up by Marcus Garvey. As a matter of fact, when Garvey came from Jamaica, he said that of all of the leaders in America, Booker T. Washington was the only one that had any sense, because he was the one who was trying to understand white supremacy and apartheid the way it was. So Garvey picked it up in 1916. And then he got accused of mail fraud and was put in prison in Atlanta. But before that happened, he organized one of the largest movements in the history of our people. I think he mobilized about 6 million people as a part of his organization, Universal Negro Improvement Association. When Garvey was taken off the scene in 1928, on the heels of Garvey came another man, actually 2 people. One was Noble Drew Ali with the Moorish Science Temple, and then the other one was Farad Muhammad, who came in 1930. And so what they did, you went from Booker T. Washington to Marcus Garvey, and from that, then the Islamic nationalism came out in those 2 movements, the Moorish Science Temple, Noble Drew Ali, and then the Nation of Islam with Farad Muhammad, and later Elijah Muhammad, who picked it up from Farad Muhammad.
That's interesting.
Yes, and then of course with the civil rights movement, then out of that came, you know, Martin Luther King and A. Philip Randolph with the Pulling the Cars Porter. So you had these 2 movements, and eventually we come to the point where Malcolm and Martin come on the scene in the mid-1950s. Malcolm being associated with his Mosque No. 7 in Harlem, and Martin Luther King coming on the stage at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, and then later he went to Ebenezer there in Atlanta. So when those two men came on the scene, the gap between the two was getting narrower and smaller. So we started out with the two extremes, either assimilate here as a domestic strategy or repatriate back to Africa. Most people didn't want that. So now you deal with integration versus separation. And then in the case of Martin and Malcolm, it was separation versus integration. But Elijah Muhammad was not like Marcus Garvey. He did not necessarily want to go back to Africa. He was pushing more an idea of reparations. He wanted the United States government to give African Americans some arable states in the South mainly, 2 or 3 states, so that it could develop a nation within a nation. Of course, that was utopian thinking because, you know, a civil war was fought when the Southerners broke away from the Union. But that, you know, never happened. So he was pushing a philosophy of reparation for the pain and suffering of slavery, separation from whites because they didn't want to integrate, and then self-determination, economic self-determination. So he was more or less embraced Booker T. Washington's economic agenda. When Martin Luther King came along, the dominant civil rights movement was the NAACP. And of course, A. Philip Randolph with the labor movement, the Pullman car porters. And so you had a labor agenda with A. Philip Randolph, and then you had Rel Wilkins with the NAACP. But their battle was mainly in the courts. It was when Martin Luther King came along that the fight was actually taken to the streets, and they embraced